Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture, was a Trinidadian-American revolutionary active in the civil rights movement, and later, the global Pan-African movement. Growing up in the United States from the age of 11, he graduated from Howard University. He rose to prominence in the civil rights and Black Power movements, first as a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, later as the Honorary Prime Minister of the Black Panther Party, and finally as a leader of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. Early life and education. Born in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, Stokely Carmichael attended Tranquility School there before moving to Harlem, in New York, in 1952 at the age of 11, to rejoin his parents who had emigrated to the U.S. when he was age 2, leaving him with his grandmother and 2 aunts. He had 3 sisters. His mother, Mabel R. Carmichael, was a stewardess for a steamship line. His father, Adolphus, was a carpenter who also worked as a taxi driver. The reunited Carmichael family eventually left Harlem to live in Van Nest in the East Bronx, at the time an aging neighborhood with residents who were primarily Jewish and Italian immigrants and descendants. According to a 1967 interview he gave to Life magazine, Carmichael was the only black member of the Morris Park Jukes, a youth gang involved in alcohol and petty theft. He attended the elite, selective Bronx High School of Science in New York, with entrance based on academic performance. After graduation in 1960, Carmichael enrolled at Howard University, a historically black university in Washington, D.C. His professors included Sterling Brown, Nathan Hare, and Toni Morrison, a writer who later won the Nobel Prize. Carmichael and Tom Kahn, a Jewish-American student and civil rights activist, helped to fund a 5-day run of the Three-Penny Opera, by Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill. Tom Kahn, very shrewdly, had captured the position of treasurer of the Liberal Arts Student Council and the infinitely charismatic and popular Carmichael as floor whip was good at lining up the votes. Before they knew what hit them, the Student Council had become a patron of the arts, having voted to buy out the remaining performances. It was a classic win-win. Members of the council got patronage packets of tickets for distribution to friends and constituents. Carmichael's apartment on Euclid Street was a gathering place for his activist classmates. He graduated in 1964 with a degree in philosophy. Carmichael was offered a full graduate scholarship to Harvard University, but turned it down. Political activism. While at Howard, Carmichael had joined the Nonviolent Action Group, the Howard campus affiliate of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Kahn introduced Carmichael and the other SNCC activists to Bayard Rustin, an African-American leader who became an influential advisor to SNCC. Inspired by the sit-ins in the South, during college Carmichael became more active in the civil rights movement. Freedom rides. In his first year at the university, in 1961, he participated in the freedom rides of the Congress of Racial Equality to desegregate the bus station restaurants along U.S. Route 40 between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. and was frequently arrested, spending time in jail. He was arrested so many times for his activism that he lost count, sometimes estimating at least 29 of 32. In 1998, he told the Washington Post that he thought the total was fewer than 36, along with 8 other riders. On June 4, 1961, Carmichael traveled by train from New Orleans, Louisiana, to Jackson, Mississippi, to integrate the formerly white section on the train. Before getting on the train in New Orleans, they encountered white protesters blocking the way. Carmichael says, "They were shouting, throwing cans and lit cigarettes at us, spitting on us. Eventually, they were able to board the train. When the group arrived in Jackson, Carmichael and the 8 other riders entered a white cafeteria. They were charged with disturbing the peace, arrested and taken to jail. Eventually, Carmichael was transferred to the infamous Parchman Farm in Sunflower County, Mississippi, along with other freedom riders. He gained notoriety for being a witty and hard-nosed leader among the prisoners. He served 49 days with other activists at the Parchman State Prison Farm. At 19 years of age, Carmichael was the youngest detainee in the summer of 1961. He spent 53 days at Parchman Farm in a 6x9 cell, twice a week to shower. No books, nothing to do. They would isolate us. Maximum security. Carmichael said about the Parchman Farm sheriff, "The sheriff acted like he was scared of black folks and he came up with some beautiful things. One night he opened up all the windows, put on 10 big fans and an air conditioner and dropped the temperature to 38 degrees. All we had on was t-shirts and shorts." While being hurt one time, Carmichael began singing to the guards, "I'm gonna tell God how you treat me," to which the rest of the prisoners joined in. Carmichael kept the group's morale up while in prison, often telling jokes with Steve Green and the other freedom riders, and making light of the situation. He knew the situation was serious. What with the range of ideology, religious belief, political commitment and background, age and experience, something interesting was always going on. Because no matter our differences, this group had one thing in common: moral stubbornness. Whatever we believed, we really believed and were not at all shy about advancing. We were where we were only because of our willingness to affirm our beliefs even at the risk of physical injury. So it was never dull on death row. In a 1964 interview with author Robert Penn Warren, Carmichael reflected on his motives for going on the rides, saying, "I thought I have to go because you've got to keep the issue alive, and you've got to show the Southerners that you're not gonna be scared off, as we've been scared off in the past. And no matter what they do, we're still gonna keep coming back." SNCC. Mississippi and Cambridge, Maryland. In 1964, Carmichael became a full-time field organizer for SNCC in Mississippi. He worked on the Greenwood Voting Rights Project under Robert Parris Moses. Throughout Freedom Summer, he worked with grassroots African American activists, including Fannie Lou Hamer, whom Carmichael named as one of his personal heroes. SNCC organizer Joanne Gavin wrote that Hamer and Carmichael understood one another as perhaps no one else could. Quote, "He also worked closely with Gloria Richardson, who led the SNCC chapter in Cambridge, Maryland. During a protest with Richardson in Maryland in June 1964, Carmichael was hit directly in a chemical gas attack by the National Guard and had to be hospitalized. He soon became project director for Mississippi's 2nd Congressional District, made up largely in the counties of the Mississippi Delta. At the time, most blacks in Mississippi were still disenfranchised. The summer project was to prepare them to register to vote and to conduct a parallel registration movement to demonstrate how much people wanted to vote. Grassroots activists organized the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, as the regular Democratic Party did not represent African Americans in the state. At the end of Freedom Summer, Carmichael went to the 1964 Democratic Convention in support of the MFDP, which sought to have its delegation seated. But the MFDP delegates were refused voting rights by the Democratic National Committee, who chose to seat the regular white Jim Crow delegation. Carmichael, along with many SNCC staff members, left the convention with a profound sense of disillusionment in the American political system, and what he later called totalitarian liberal opinion. Accusations of anti-Semitism and misogyny, Jews had comprised a disproportionate number of the white supporters of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. The subsequent rejection of white activists from groups like SNCC in core, accompanied by ideological factors such as the shift in emphasis to a revolutionary anti-colonialist struggle, and anti-Zionist sympathy for the Palestinians, led to a permanent souring of relations in America between blacks and Jews. Although he stated in his posthumously published memoirs that he had never been anti-Semitic, in 1970 Carmichael proclaimed, "I have never admired a white man, but the greatest of them, to my mind, was Hitler." In November 1964 Carmichael made a joking remark in response to a SNCC position paper written by his friends Casey Hayden and Mary E. King on the position of women in the movement. In the course of an irreverent comedy monologue he performed at a party after SNCC's Waveland conference, Carmichael said, "The position of women in the movement is prone." A number of women were offended. In a 2006 The Chronicle of Higher Education article, historian Penny Lee Joseph later wrote, while the remark was made in jest during a 1964 conference, Carmichael and Black Power activists did embrace an aggressive vision of manhood, one centered on black men's ability to deploy authority, punishment, and power, in that they generally reflected the wider society's blinders about women and politics. When asked about the comment, former SNCC Field Secretary Casey Hayden stated, "Our paper on the position of women came up, and Stokely in his hipster-rap comedic way joked that the proper position of women in SNCC is prone." I laughed. He laughed. We all laughed. Stokely was a friend of mine. A former SNCC worker identified only as Tyler on the internet claimed, "I will forever remember Stokely Carmichael as the one who said the position of women in the movement is prone." This viciously anti-women outlook is another reason why all of these nationalist movements went nowhere. In her memoir, Mary E. King wrote that Carmichael was poking fun at his own attitudes, and that Casey and I felt, and continue to feel, that Stokely was one of the most responsive men at the time that our anonymous paper appeared in 1964. Carmichael appointed several women to posts as project directors during his tenure as chairman of SNCC. By the latter half of the 1960s, more women were in charge of SNCC projects than during the first half. Selma to Montgomery marches, having developed aversion to working with the Democratic Party after the 1964 convention experience, Carmichael decided to leave the MFDP. Instead he began exploring SNCC projects in Alabama in 1965. During the period of the Selma to Montgomery marches, he was recruited by James Forman to participate in their Second Front to stage protests at the Alabama state capitol in March 1965. Carmichael became disillusioned with the growing struggles between SNCC and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who opposed Forman's strategy. He thought SCLC was working with affiliated black churches to undercut it. He was also frustrated to be drawn again into nonviolent confrontations with police, which he no longer found empowering. After seeing protesters brutally beaten again, he collapsed from stress, and his colleagues urged him to leave the city. Within a week, Carmichael returned to protesting, this time in Selma, to participate in the final march along Route 80. He initiated a grassroots project in Bloody Lowndes County, along the march route. This was a county known for white violence, where SCLC and Dr. King had tried and failed to organize its black residents. Lowndes County Freedom Organization. In 1965, working as a SNCC activist in the black-majority Lowndes County, Carmichael helped to increase the number of registered black black voters from 70 to 600 to 300 more than the number of registered white voters. Black voters had essentially been disfranchised by Alabama's Constitution passed by white Democrats in 1901. After congressional passage in August of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the federal government was authorized to oversee and enforce the rights, but there was still tremendous resistance by whites in the area, endangering activists. Black residents and voters organized and widely supported the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, a party that had the Black Panther as its mascot, over the white-dominated local Democratic Party, whose mascot was a white rooster. Since federal protection from violent voter suppression by the Ku Klux Klan and other white opponents was sporadic, most Lowndes County activists openly carried arms. Although black residents and voters outnumbered whites in Lowndes, their candidate lost the county-wide election of 1965. In 1966, several LFCO candidates ran for office in the general election but failed to win. In 1970, the LCFO merged with the statewide Democratic Party, and former LCFO candidates won the first offices in the county. Chair of SNCC and Black Power Carmichael became chairman of SNCC in 1966, taking over from John Lewis, who later was elected to the U.S. Congress. A few weeks after Carmichael took office, James Meredith was shot and wounded by a shotgun during his solitary march against fear. Carmichael joined Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., Floyd McKissick, Cleveland Sellers and others to continue Meredith's march. He was arrested during the march and, upon his release, he gave his first Black Power speech, using the phrase to urge black pride and socio-economic independence, according to historian David J. Garrow, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his book bearing the cross. Martin Luther King, Jr., and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a few days after Carmichael used the Black Power slogan at the Meredith March Against Fear. He reportedly told King, "Martin, I deliberately decided to raise this issue on the march in order to give it a national forum and force you to take a stand for Black Power." King responded, "I have been used before. One more time won't hurt." While Black Power was not a new concept, Carmichael's speech brought it into the spotlight. It became a rallying cry for young African Americans across the country who were frustrated about slow progress in civil rights. Everywhere that Black Power spread, if accepted, credit was given to the prominent Carmichael. If the concept was condemned, he was held responsible and blamed. According to Carmichael, Black Power meant black people coming together to form a political force and either electing representatives or forcing the representatives to speak their needs. Strongly influenced by the work of Frantz Fanon and his landmark book, The Wretched of the Earth, along with others such as Malcolm X, Carmichael led SNCC to become more radical. The group focused on Black Power as its core goal and ideology. During the controversial Atlanta Project in 1966, SNCC, under the local leadership of Bill Ware, engaged in a voter drive to promote the candidacy of Julian Bond for the Georgia state legislature in an Atlanta district. Ware excluded northern white SNCC members from this drive. Initially, Carmichael opposed him and voted against this decision, but eventually changed his mind when, at the urging of the Atlanta Project, the issue of whites in SNCC came up for a vote. Carmichael ultimately sided with those calling for the expulsion of whites. He said that whites should organize poor white Southern communities, of which there were plenty. While SNCC focused on promoting African American self-reliance through Black Power, Carmichael considered nonviolence to be a tactic as opposed to an underlying principle, which separated him from moderate civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King, Jr. Carmichael criticized civil rights leaders who called for the integration of African Americans into existing institutions of the middle class, mainstream. Under Carmichael's term, SNCC continued to maintain a coalition with several white radical organizations, most notably Students for a Democratic Society. It encouraged the SDS to focus on militant anti-draft resistance. At an SDS-organized conference at UC Berkeley in October 1966, Carmichael challenged the white left to escalate the resistance to the military draft in a manner similar to the Black movement. For a time in 1967, Carmichael considered an alliance with Saul Alinsky's Industrial Areas Foundation, and generally supported IF's work in Rochester and Buffalo's black communities. Vietnam. SNCC conducted its first actions against the military draft and the Vietnam War under Carmichael's leadership. Carmichael popularized the oft-repeated anti-draft slogan, "Hell no, we won't go." During this time, Carmichael encouraged Martin Luther King, Jr. to demand an unconditional withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam, even as some King advisers cautioned him that such opposition might have an adverse effect on financial contributions to the SCLC. King preached one of his earliest speeches calling for unconditional withdrawal with Carmichael seated in the front row at his invitation. Carmichael privately took credit for pushing King towards anti-imperialism, and historians such as Dr. Peniel Joseph and Eric Dyson agree. Carmichael joined King in New York on April 15, 1967, to share his views with protesters on race related to the Vietnam War. Transition out of SNCC. Stepping down as chair in May 1967, Carmichael stepped down as chairman of SNCC and was replaced by H. Rap Brown. SNCC was a collective and worked by group consensus rather than hierarchically. Many members had become displeased with Carmichael's celebrity status. SNCC leaders had begun to refer to him as Stokely Carmichael and criticize his habit of making policy announcements independently, before achieving internal agreement. According to historian Claiborne Carson, Carmichael did not protest the transfer of power and was eager to relinquish the chair. Quote, targeted by FBI COINTELPRO. During this period, Carmichael was targeted by a section of J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO, which focused on black activists. The program promoted slander and violence against targets that Hoover considered to be enemies of the U.S. government. Carmichael accepted the position of Honorary Prime Minister in the Black Panther Party, but also remained on the staff of SNCC, and attempted to forge a merger between the two organizations. A March 4, 1968 memo from Hoover states his fear of the rise of a black nationalist messiah and notes that Carmichael alone had the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way. In July 1968, Hoover stepped up his efforts to divide the Black Power movement. Declassified documents show a plan was launched to undermine the SNCC-Panther merger, as well as to badjacket Carmichael as a CIA agent. Both efforts were largely successful. Carmichael was expelled from SNCC that year, and rival Panthers began to denounce him. International activism. After stepping down as SNCC chair, Carmichael wrote the book Black Power with Charles V. Hamilton, while clarifying his thinking. He also continued as a strong critic of the Vietnam War and imperialism in general. During this period he traveled and lectured extensively throughout the world, visiting Guinea, North Vietnam, China, and Cuba. Carmichael became more clearly identified with the Black Panther Party as its honorary Prime Minister. During this period, he acted more as a speaker than an organizer, traveling throughout the country and internationally advocating for his vision of Black Power. Carmichael lamented the 1967 execution of Marxist revolutionary Che Guevara, saying, "The death of Che Guevara places a responsibility on all revolutionaries of the world to redouble the decision to fight on to the final defeat of imperialism. That is why in essence Che Guevara is not dead. His ideas are with us." Carmichael visited the United Kingdom in July 1967 to attend the Dialectics of Liberation conference. After recordings of his speeches were released by the organizers, the Institute of Phenomenological Studies, he was banned from re-entering Britain. 1968 D.C. riots. Carmichael was present in Washington, D.C. the night after King's assassination in April 1968. He led a group through the streets, demanding that businesses close out of respect. Although he tried to prevent violence, the situation escalated beyond his control. Due to his reputation as a provocateur, the news media blamed Carmichael for the ensuing violence as mobs rioted along U Street and other areas of black commercial development. Carmichael held a press conference the next day, at which he predicted mass racial violence in the streets. Since moving to Washington, D.C., Carmichael had been under nearly constant surveillance by the FBI. After the eruption of riots, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation J. Edgar Hoover instructed a team of agents to find evidence connecting Carmichael to these events. He was also subjected to COINTELPRO's badjacketing technique. Huey P. Newton suggested Carmichael was a Central Intelligence Agency agent, a slander that led to Carmichael's break with the Panthers, and his exile from the U.S. the following year.